Oh, sorry, God, there's a little bit of shit in my webcam. Here, let me clean some of this gamer gunk off this thing. So let's talk about the Game Boy camera, and by extension, the Game Boy printer. Is there any reason to use these things nowadays? Well, honestly, the answer is hell no. Unless you're an art student or an eccentric YouTuber who wants to play around with it because of that aesthetic. Even if not practical, I find something oh so charming about the Game Boy camera. When it launched in 1998, it was the smallest digital camera out there. I mean, yeah, the pics themselves were very small and very monochrome, but sometimes being a weird novelty is all you need to be cool. Also, I know that doesn't mean much in a world where I can film B-roll of a duck with my phone, but look, it was the 90s, it was a different time. So this is RETROspective, a series where I look at games and gaming stuff from my past to see how it stacks up today. And today we're looking at not only the Game Boy camera and Game Boy printer, but the experience using them in 2021. Today's video is sponsored by PCBWay. PCBWay is your one-stop shop for anything PCB related. But that's not all that they do. CNC machining, sheet metal fabrication, 3D printing, and even injection services are all available at reasonable rates to help you breathe life into your projects. Follow the link in the description below to get an instant quote now, and even check out their community section where you can see boards created by their ever-growing community of users. Like, look at these Pokemon Crystal Game Boy cartridge boards, found and ordered straight from their site. Thank you again, PCBWay, for making what I do possible. Now, as for the Game Boy camera, I have an odd history of this thing. Years ago, when I was still living in Texas, I went to a half-price books in Houston, and I found one of them for $5 whole American dollars. Remember when you could find old video game stuff for only $5? You okay?
I'm trying not to make noise setting down my Sour Patch Kids. I'm so sorry.
Baby, no, I promise it's okay. I love you.
I was trying not to crinkle, but it was crinkling and it was giving me anxiety because, like, you're recording.
Anyways, the one I bought was this green one right here, and worked like a charm the first time I used it with my childhood Game Boy Advance SP. So what makes my Game Boy camera so odd? I mean, you know, besides the fact that I should have been tipped off by the fact that I had to clean some sticky gunk off of mine using a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol. Well, you see, first time I booted up my Game Boy camera and I went into the album section, I looked at the pictures. I was greeted by photos of a guy, a very, he wasn't below average, but average length dude, just, you know. What I really appreciate about the Game Boy camera is just how easy it is to use. It requires no batteries or a power supply of its own, just a Game Boy with an open cartridge slot. And yes, this even works with, say, the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo, or the Game Boy player for the GameCube, albeit those are much more bulky. It does not, unfortunately, work on the Retro Freak, which sucks, as I figure if you can use a Game Boy camera on a device with HDMI output, I could then capture it through my capture card and use my GB cam as a webcam. And indeed, this is something some have done. Now, I did later find a way to simulate doing this, but before I dive into that, I want to dive into a bit of what the Game Boy camera itself can do. Created in part by Creatures Inc., you may know better for their involvement with the Pokemon series, along with Japanese developer Jupiter and Nintendo's R&D 1 team, the Game Boy camera featured a 128 by 128 pixel CMOS sensor, could store 128 by 112 grayscale images. Now, those images are tiny, even if they are cool. And for just some context on how tiny those are, here's a Game Boy camera image in its original size, presented in the middle of the screen here. Pictures need a lot of lighting to come out properly too, but not too much, or you could just blow it out, overexpose it. At the very least though, you can swivel the camera around to take some old school selfies. Speaking of old school, using an original pea green black screen Game Boy is honestly a bit painful here due to motion blur. And though some may think these pictures look like a bunch of pixelated shit, I think they have a really unique aesthetic. It's just weirdly charming to me. But taking pics isn't all you can do either. You can manipulate your pictures with filters, decorate them with stickers, add frames, and even play mini games. Now, speaking of mini games, you kids like balls? You can even make a little personal info card. And you do this in space? Okay, I know that space thing might seem a little weird, along with the RPG style menu in the camera section, but there is a lot of weirdness packed into this cartridge. Along with the Game & Watch ball minigame, there's also a basic shoot 'em up here called Space Fever 2, along with a secret hidden minigame. There's also a basic music sequencer, and even a dancing Mario on the title screen, set to a tune that I can really and truly describe as electronic bliss. Hell, if you were in Japan, you could use the Nintendo 64 transfer pack to use your pictures in games like Mario Artist and Sims 60/64. And if those names sound familiar, yeah, those are Nintendo 64 DD games, and if you don't know what that is, don't worry, you aren't missing much. You kids like floppies? Speaking of transferring pictures, if you have a Game Boy link cable, one of the coolest things you can do with the Game Boy camera is print out your pictures. There's even a printer made just for this purpose, the aptly named Game Boy printer. Also released in 1998, this is a thermal printer that prints out your tiny sticker-sized pics on what basically feels like receipt paper. And this thing was very fickle to get set up. To start, I took a picture of this giant Eevee here, and then popped 6 AA batteries into the gaping hole in the back. And on the topic of those AA's, those 6 AA's were in addition to the 4 powering the OG Game Boy. Yeah, as I'm going to be as weird and retro as possible for this vid, I decided I wanted to print something out using my original brick Game Boy. And I thought I had a cable that'd work, but nope. It's just a standard original link cable, which has a different size to the one used in the Game Boy Pocket Light Color and Printer. At this point I went screw it, and brought out my complete in-box Game Boy Pocket. Look at how minty that thing is. Unfortunately, that was only to realize that that thing takes 2 AAA batteries, and I have none of those around. So on to the Game Boy Color. Now the weird thing about my Game Boy Color is that every time I tried to print something, it gave me an error. I recentered my new old stock roll of paper, but no luck. Error after error, and the same error every time. And apparently this particular error message meant that the camera literally could not detect a cable being plugged in. Even cleaning the cable and points of connection didn't help. So at this point I was starting to feel a little defeated. I just wanted to print this picture out and show you all this Game Boy accessory in action. And then my fiance informed me that the Game Boy Advance had the same size link cable port as the Game Boy Color, which meant that yes, the cable would work there, and this would work, assuming the cable wasn't the problem. Once again, I hooked everything up. I braced myself for the depressing darkness of the dim screen of the original Game Boy Advance, and I held my breath as I pressed print. And finally, after a bit of a loading screen, it started to print. And it printed out perfectly, even on this older paper. And then for good measure, I printed another copy of this pic, just because I thought it looked nice. This was a bit of a misadventure, but honestly it's really cool, and I'm really glad that my camera and printer still work mostly pretty well. If you want to fool around with the Game Boy camera nowadays though, I'd recommend not using a Game Boy at all, and instead downloading the MGBA emulator for PC. This emulator features full Game Boy camera emulation support, and even allows you to use a webcam with the camera. And overall works great, with the only finicky bit being a need to restart the emulator every time you switch what webcam it's using. It's overall the best way to toy around with it though. Also, here's my obligatory don't do a piracy ROMs bad Nintendo don't sue me bit, and also a plea for, hey, Nintendo. I don't know, maybe we need a Game Boy camera mini or something. Be a good stocking stuffer at least. So on that note, that's it for today's video on the Game Boy camera and Game Boy printer experience in 2021. Now as you can see, this kind of isn't really my usual setup. It's a little messy, and that's because we're moving. I've mentioned a while back that we were thinking about moving to Nova Scotia. Now things are all sorts of weird. Basically, the long and the short is that the complex I'm in Victoria, where our townhouse is, basically one of our neighbors' places caught on fire, and it made I think it was 8 other residencies here completely uninhabitable. Fire started in the kitchen, from what we heard, which makes me feel really unsafe, like using the kitchen in this current place and looking off to the right towards it. So we were wanting to move anyways, so we're just going for it. I'm not sure if we'll go for Nova Scotia or if we'll go back to the States somewhere. We might feel things out for a bit. Definitely gonna spend a bit of time at my parents' place, at least for a few weeks. It's fine anyways, because Xander and I are getting married. Finally, next month. We were going down there anyways, now it's just, we're going down and not returning, because, but it's that thing where you this is some sort of sick joke where you wake up to literally hearing someone scream because they're being killed by burning debris. Yeah, no, seriously, one of my neighbors died. But anyways, so that's kind of the long and the short. We're packing up. This is going to be the last vid we do in Victoria, fully in Victoria. I mean, of course I have B-roll, and I'm working on a video on the advanced Pico Bina from Sega right now, which I'll probably be editing on our way to the States. But this is the last one fully filmed and edited in Vic. Place a mess. We're packing boxes. We're looking in the U-Hauls, and we're trying to do a thing. And if you'd like to help support us right now, then definitely consider backing me on Patreon. Join the folks you see on screen right now. Get Stuff We Play merch. We have hoodies, we have shirts, and you get 20% off at the merch store through Patreon, along with joining our Discord server and getting early content. I guess the other thing I want to go into, I'm doing this all off the cuff, is our place thankfully isn't super affected or anything. We are in our place right now, but it's even the chance of something like that happening here is like you kind of going out of a complex if something that happens, at least to me. Maybe it's a little paranoid. But on that note, thank you very much for watching. Stay classy, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.